My name is Andrei Stanciu, and I am a policy researcher for Vocal Europe. On today's Monday Talks episode, we are joined by His Excellency Mr. Mantas Adomėnas, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania, to discuss the ongoing migration crisis at Lithuania's borders with Belarus, as well as the EU's economic sanctions against Alexander Lukashenko's regime and its support for the Belarusian democratic opposition. Mr. Vice Minister, it is a pleasure and an honor to have you here today with us. I would like to begin our discussion by addressing the topic which made several international headlines during the past weeks. As we know, since last June, the EU has introduced a new package of economic sanctions against the Belarusian regime, action which has been responded to by the regime in Minsk with a series of retaliatory steps, such as suspending its membership within the Eastern Partnership Program, canceling its readmission agreement with the EU on illegal migration, and most notoriously engaging into a deliberate act of weaponization of migration, if I might say so, by smuggling thousands of undocumented migrants across Lithuania's borders. Vice Minister Adomėnas, I would like to ask you if you could give us a brief insight into how has this crisis developed, how is Lithuania currently dealing with it, and most importantly, what is in the works at EU level to address the situation?
Thank you. This didn't start with the introduction of the fourth package of sanctions. In fact, now that we look back, we see that preparation for the migrant flow, for engineering sort of uncontrollable migrant flow across the border of Lithuania started as early as March. And the results were already felt in April. They gathered speed in May, and then sort of it was really escalated in June. So in fact, when the regime says that it's in response to sanctions, it was already preparing that tool early on, and as a way of retaliating for Lithuania's and the EU's principled stance regarding the human rights violations and incarcerations of political opponents by Lukashenko regimes. Yes, the height was reached in July when we had sort of 3,000 migrants in 1 month alone, and continues at the same pace sort of into August. So this is very worrying insofar as for the first time the plight of the migrants has been used as a sort of very explicitly and very intentionally as a tool of political pressure. So it's very important that EU and Lithuania do not blink and do not give up on this sort of sanctions regime, insofar as that would mean that every sort of dictator who has a border with EU has a tool of political pressure which they would use at libitum to pressure EU into sort of succumbing to this political weaponized migration flows. In fact, I think that trying to dialogue, as some political persons suggest, political figures suggest, dialogue with Lukashenko about reducing the sanctions would be like negotiating with terrorists. It only sort of affirms them that they have a sort of an efficient weapon in their hands and would encourage its further use. So painful though it is, and I'm speaking from Lithuania, which is experiencing it at its most painful. We have to sort of not to yield an inch to Lukashenko, and in fact, the only way of dealing it is as a credible threat of further sanctions, further economic sanctions, because in introducing sectorial economic sanctions in June, EU still left quite a few wide gaps in the structure of these sanctions. So the most vulnerable categories for Lukashenko, such as potassium fertilizer, tobacco products, electricity, they're still not included in the sanctions. And so we have a space to go, we have leverage, and we have to be sort of united in issuing as a credible threat, and that if Lukashenko does not check the migration flows, we'll be introducing a further round of sanctions. And I think that should work. I think that's the way we should go. And for once show that that EU has proper backbone. It's not going to yield. It's not going to step back. That's, I think, is the only way of dealing with dictators like Lukashenko.
Well, regarding the topic of economic sanctions, since you pointed out the sanctions have been introduced perhaps belatedly to the regime's lawlessness, this has been a criticism that has been published by several politicians and political pundits alike, who argued that fifth package of economic sanctions is long overdue by now. From your distinguished opinion, Mr. Adomėnas, how do you see the EU's overall performance in addressing the human rights situation in Belarus until now, over the years?
I think EU has allowed Lukashenko to kind of get used to and refine the game of we call it trafficking political prisoners, political prisoner trafficking. After each stolen election, and there have been several, 2010 and then sort of subsequent ones, he would imprison his principal political opponents, and then EU would introduce some sanctions, and then he would release them to great fanfare, restoration of economic relations, and reduction of sanctions. So this is, he was basically sort of trading the freedom of these political prisoners and buying sort of a reduction of sanctions. This time he has stepped one step too far, but he was emboldened by the fact that previously EU had no sort of staying power. It sort of, it was always very happy to jump in sort of bed of economic relations with Lukashenko as soon as there was a sort of an excuse, a formal excuse to do so. By hijacking the plane to kidnap his political opponent and his girlfriend, by sort of imprisoning more than 500 political prisoners, by beating up and arresting hundreds of thousands of Belarusians, I think he's now crossed the red border, and EU should not repeat its past mistakes by allowing him to get from the sanctions by just showing some formal signs of stepping down a little bit. So in fact, this is now time to reform our sanctions regime vis-a-vis Belarus, and the fourth sanction, which followed very rapidly after the hijacking of Ryanair flight, was a sign that Europe is acting for once in unity, resolutely, and in solidarity. The economic sanctions that followed were long overdue. That's true. They could have been much more effective had they been introduced earlier, when the regime was still sort of tottering after mass protests. And it's a shame that so many EU members actually sort of blocked and vetoed the economic sanctions when they were mooted in the autumn of 2020. This could have been really a game changer. But better late than never. We have the first sort of package of sanctions. They're still not as comprehensive as they could be, and not as sharp biting. And that, of course, gives us leverage to threaten him further. But if we want a change of the regime, we have to go further with it.
Well, since you mentioned the arrest of Roman Protasevich, after the Ryanair incident, the EU has indefinitely suspended all of its air traffic with Belarus after the regime's blatant violation of international civil aviation codes. Generally speaking, European and Belarusian representatives of civil society have argued that this decision will harm ordinary Belarusians the most, as it effectively deprives them of any way of escaping Lukashenko's dictatorship. From your distinguished position as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, could you tell us a bit about how this decision is currently deliberated at EU Council level, given the ongoing migration context right now in Lithuania?
If anything, now the migration crisis is an argument in the case for further reducing Belarusia's access and undertaking further sanctions against it. It's, by the way, it's an interesting fact that virtually all, absolute majority of Belarusian planes are leased from an EU company. So they have European ownership. These planes which are used to bring illegal migrants to which Lukashenko uses as a weapon. So that's an interesting position for that company, and I would like to ask how they evaluate that. But relating to your question, there are no questions asked about this sort of revocation of sanctions for Belarus, and it's not the way that the Belarusian civil society used to get out. I mean, sort of, if you are in danger of being arrested, the last thing you do is get on a Belarus flight, because you will be sort of taken off the plane before it takes off. There are routes that Lithuania, as well as other EU countries, used to employ in order to get the people who are under threat of the repressions or arrest out of the country. I should mention that Lithuania has issued 2,500 humanitarian visas to Belarusian activists, civil society organizers, journalists, students, and just generally people who were sort of either in danger or had already undergone a repression. So we're not afraid of genuine political refugees, and that we have ways of getting them out of the country, and in such a way that they do not risk arrest. If need be, we should, with documents and which are needed. But Belarus case is really sort of limiting the access of the regime to European capitals. After they've violated all international norms in making the forced landing of Ryanair flights. It was just a political impossibility that Belarus should continue to fly. And I think this isolation is quite giving positive results in sort of exerting pressure on the regime, which now sort of is becoming more and more like North Korean. And of course, it's up to the Belarusian people when they will sort of stop putting up with that. But I don't think there is a case really for revoking those sanctions.
Thank you. Vice Minister Adomėnas, since it is pretty much common knowledge that Lukashenko's regime's lawlessness relies primarily on financial and even tactical support from Russia, in your distinguished opinion, to what extent should the EU consider or is considering to merge its policy on Belarus with a more comprehensive Russia policy?
That's a very good question and a very valid suggestion, and that's what we've been sort of talking all along, that to resolve a problem of Belarus is impossible without a policy vis-a-vis Russia, and not to see the Russian hand, and that it sustains the regime, that it sort of gives it the wherewithal with which to survive and to pay the armed goons who beat up the protesters it would be sort of closing one's eyes to the important part of reality. So yes, there should be a sort of comprehensive policy, and yes, the role of Russia should be recognized in this, and most of all, on no circumstances there should be any recognition of any yielding of sovereignty that is currently going under Lukashenko's rule. So all the articles of the Union Treaty, of the Unified States Treaty, should be recognized, nor any acts such as withdrawal from the Eastern Partnership or a rescinding of EU-Belarus agreement on cooperation and border management. These things should not be so recognized, because they are not performed by a legitimate ruler of the country. Insofar as we maintain the election, which happened almost a year ago, as having been stolen from the Belarusian people as illegitimate, any sort of cession of Belarusian sovereignty is invalid and should not be recognized, just as the occupation of Crimea is not recognized. And we should really draw very clear red lines for Russia that if it tries to annex or to make an Anschluss of Belarus, this is going to be resisted as the annexation of Crimea is resisted.
Vice Minister Adomėnas, during the past year, Lithuania has become the most vocal supporter of the Belarusian democratic opposition at EU level. And several discussions I'm sure you had with leaders of the Belarusian opposition, Besides the need for economic sanctions, what have been the main issues where the opposition leaders advocated for a more comprehensive EU involvement in their countries to strive for a democratic revolution, if I may say so? And subsequently, is Lithuania considering any other potential courses of action that are yet to be discussed at EU level?
Certainly, apart from the sanctions, what was discussed is the plan of assistance for the democratic Belarus. And of course, it is, I think, vital that there is a sort of positive counterpart, that there is not just sanctions to the regime, but also a perspective of rebuilding independent, economically viable and forward-looking Belarus once it has it has democratically elected authorities installed. So this is something that I think is very important both to the Belarusian opposition, but also to Europe, and in securing that there is a sort of scenario how to get a country back on its feet, and I think there is great potential for Belarus there. It's strategically located. It has sort of very talented human resources. I think this roadmap should really work and be very, very fruitful. And this is something that has been discussed a lot, and EU is ready to stand by with its offer of assistance to rebuild the country on democratic lines. And of course, it's up to the Belarusian citizens to choose the course of development which they want to adopt, in which geopolitical direction. But Europe is always ready to help to build a sort of a democratic state in its neighborhood. So this is something that has been discussed, has been worked out. Scenarios there, funds are there. It only needs free and fair elections and the international observation and release of all political prisoners, and then we can embrace Belarus back in the European family of nations.
Thank you. Your Excellency, I'm afraid these are all the topics we could touch upon today. Thank you very much for your distinguished insights. And we are looking forward to hear from you again, and hope you find our exchange as pleasant as we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have to keep the 5 seconds rule now, but thank you very much for very intelligent questions. And then really it was a joy to think about it. And I hope that what I could contribute was useful. And I'm sure that we'll be in touch in the future.